All right, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into AI research that could totally change how we use our devices.
Like what?
Well, think about having a digital assistant that's really helpful.
Okay.
Like scheduling appointments or finding any file you need, even writing emails for you.
Uh-huh.
That's what AI agents that use our devices just like we do could be capable of.
Yeah, this paper we're looking at, OS Genesis, tackles a big challenge in getting these AI agents trained without tons of data from humans.
Right, because the traditional way of training them has been kind of slow, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's like either you have to have humans record every single click and swipe they make, which takes forever, or you have to rely on pre-programmed tasks that are pretty limited and not that realistic.
Yeah, think about how you actually use your phone. It's probably different from how anyone else uses it.
Right.
You probably have your own shortcuts and habits.
Absolutely.
Those can be tough to capture with the traditional ways of training AI.
Yeah.
But OS Genesis, it's different. Instead of starting with tasks, it lets the AI agent explore the interface randomly, kind of like someone trying out a new app for the first time.
It's just clicking buttons and swiping around.
Yeah.
A little chaotic, but I like where this is going.
It might seem that way at first, but here's where the really cool part of this system comes in.
Okay.
It uses something called reverse task synthesis.
Reverse task synthesis.
OS Genesis watches how the interface changes when the agent does something,
Okay.
and then it works backward to figure out what task the agent was probably trying to do.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So if the agent hits the send email button and a new message pops up, the system's like, oh, that must have been the compose email task.
Exactly. It's like watching someone solve a puzzle and then trying to retrace their steps, but instead of puzzle pieces, we're talking about clicks, swipes, changes in the interface.
Wow. So it's not just recording these actions, it's understanding their purpose. This is more than a list of clicks. It's a collection of meaningful tasks the agent has learned how to do.
Exactly.
That's really impressive. But what about mistakes?
Of course.
What if it accidentally deletes something or gets stuck?
Yeah, there are going to be some hiccups.
Right.
That's where this trajectory reward model, or TRM, comes in.
Okay.
It's like a built-in coach that evaluates how well the agent is doing.
Like a glader.
Yeah, and it looks at things like whether the agent actually finished the task and if the steps it took made sense.
So it's not just about identifying the tasks, but filtering out the bad attempts.
Exactly. It's like quality control for the AI's learning process.
Gotcha. And then it uses this feedback to get better at interacting with the interface.
Right.
So we have this system that can explore, learn, and even judge its own progress. Now, did they actually test this thing out? How did it do in real-world situations?
Yeah, they tested OS Genesis on 2 benchmarks. One called Android World that simulates tasks on a virtual Android phone, and the other Web Arena where agents have to navigate real websites. They wanted to see how well it did compared to the usual ways of training AI agents.
Interesting. Okay, so not just theoretical examples, but situations that are actually similar to how people use devices.
Right.
What were the results?
Well, they were really impressive, especially with Android World. The AI agents that were trained using OS Genesis were way better at completing those tasks compared to those trained with the traditional methods.
Really?
In some cases, almost twice as good.
Wait, double.
Yeah.
So imagine your digital assistant being twice as good at finding that file you need or booking your appointments perfectly. That's a huge GE improvement.
Definitely. And even on Web Arena, which is tougher because websites are so different and complex, OS Genesis still showed big improvements over those traditional approaches.
Okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty of how they measured this, I'm curious about one thing. The paper mentions these backbone models. What are those exactly?
So those are the AI systems that are being trained to become these GUI agents.
Okay.
Think of them as the foundation. They used a couple of different open source models, kind of like choosing different building materials, to see how OS Genesis worked with them.
So they wanted to make sure OS Genesis wasn't just a one-trick pony.
Right.
It could work with different types of AI, not just one specific system.
Exactly. And the exciting thing is that it consistently made all of these models better.
So it's not about the specific AI you use, but a more general approach to training that can work across the board.
That's one of the most exciting things about OS Genesis. Now, are you ready to dig into some of the specifics of how they measured data diversity and performance?
Absolutely. Let's get into the details of how this thing works. It's magic.
So you ready to unpack some more of the details of this OS Genesis?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really stood out to me was this whole idea of data diversity. It seems like a key advantage of OS Genesis is that it can generate a much more varied set of training data than those task-driven approaches.
Yeah, one of the big limitations of those older methods is that they're basically limited to the tasks you program into them.
So it's like teaching someone to cook, but you only give them like 5 recipes.
Exactly. They might master those 5 dishes, but ask them to make something else, they'd be totally lost.
Yeah, they wouldn't have that flexibility that comes from real-world experience.
Right.
Whereas OS Genesis takes this exploration-first approach.
Yeah, it's more like giving that aspiring chef free reign in a fully stocked kitchen. Just say, go wild, see what you can create.
And then figure out the recipe based on what they
Yeah,
made.
I love that analogy. But how do you actually measure this data diversity? How do you know OS Genesis is generating a wider range of examples?
Well, they looked at 2 things, instruction diversity and trajectory diversity.
Okay, so break those down for me. What do those terms mean here? So instruction diversity refers to the variety of high-level tasks that the system can figure out, like the range of different goals the AI agent can learn to achieve. They used a technique called sentence BERT, which basically turns those instructions into a format you can compare mathematically. The more different the instructions, the higher the diversity.
So it's like analyzing the language of the tasks.
Exactly. And they found that OS Genesis had way higher instruction diversity compared to those task-driven and self-instruct methods.
That makes sense. It's exploring a wider range of actions, so it's going to discover more unique tasks.
Right.
Okay, what about trajectory diversity?
So that focuses on the actual steps the agent takes to do those tasks. Because remember, there might be lots of ways to do the same thing within an interface.
Oh, right. Like there are at least 3 ways I can open a new tab in my browser. I can use the menu, a keyboard shortcut, or right-click on a tab.
Exactly. And OS Genesis showed the highest trajectory diversity, meaning it wasn't just finding more tasks, but more ways to do them.
It reflects that flexibility we see in real-world behavior.
Right.
Okay, so this all sounds super promising, but we got to talk about something the paper mentions.
What's that?
This trajectory reward model that grades the agent, it uses GPT-4o. Isn't that proprietary? Not everyone can use that.
That's true. Right now, those open source models aren't quite as good at understanding complex instructions or working in those dynamic environments GUI agents need.
So replicating this research exactly might be hard for people who don't have access to GPT-4o.
For now, yeah. But it's important to remember that open source AI is constantly evolving.
So the main ideas of OS Genesis are still really valuable.
Yes, even if the exact implementation might need tweaking as the technology gets better.
Okay, good. It really makes you wonder what we'll see as researchers use these techniques and push things even further.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where it leads. OS Genesis is just the start of a whole new way of thinking about AI development.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, the paper mentions they tested OS Genesis on both mobile and web. Did it perform differently in those settings?
Oh, that's interesting. While it showed improvements in both areas, there were definitely some differences.
Wow.
Like on Android World, which was about mobile apps, it achieved those really dramatic performance gains, almost doubling the success rate.
Right.
But on Web Arena, with the functional websites, the improvements were smaller. Still significant, but smaller.
I wonder why that is. Are websites just way more complex than mobile apps?
I think it's probably a mix of things. Mobile apps tend to be simpler with fewer actions and interactions, while websites can be crazy complex and dynamic with lots of potential actions and variations in how things are designed.
So it's harder for the AI to learn.
Yeah, like trying to learn a language where the rules keep changing. It points to something important for future research, how to adapt these techniques for the web's complexities.
So we have this powerful approach showing really promising results, but still room for improvement.
Yeah.
What else should we consider about the bigger implications of OS Genesis?
One thing that stood out to me was the comparison they made with human annotated data.
You mean how the trajectories generated by OS Genesis stacked up against real human behavior?
Yeah. And even though OS Genesis was incredibly diverse in both instructions and trajectories, there was still a difference between its data and the human annotated data.
So even with all this, we haven't quite figured out how to perfectly copy human behavior.
Not perfectly, no. And it was interesting, the human data showed high instruction diversity, meaning humans come up with tons of different things they want to do.
Right.
But their trajectory diversity was lower, which means we tend to use a smaller set of actions to actually do those things.
Like we might have all these crazy ideas, but in practice, we stick to our routines.
Exactly. We're creatures of habit.
Even online. So where does that leave us? Is it even possible to create a system that can really capture all the nuances of human behavior?
That's a big question. And while OS Genesis doesn't completely close the gap, it gets much closer. Remember, those agents trained on its data performed at over 80% compared to those trained on human data.
That's still super impressive. It's almost as good as the real thing.
I think so, and it shows how powerful it can be to let AI systems learn by doing rather than programming every scenario.
It's like we're moving away from that rigid, rule-based AI to something more flexible.
Exactly, and that opens up so many possibilities.
Okay, before we get into those, I want to ask about scaling trajectory data.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Basically, it means increasing the amount of data used to train the AI agents. It's like asking, what happens when we give it even more examples to learn from?
And more data is better, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
The more examples, the better it should be at understanding the patterns. But there's a limit to how much you gain from just adding more and more data.
So there's a point of diminishing returns.
Exactly. As they used more OS Genesis data, performance did get better, but eventually it plateaued.
So there's a sweet spot in how much data you need to really train these agents.
Yeah. Which makes sense if you think about the limits of AI. It can only absorb so much information.
Right, like they've learned all they can.
Exactly. And this shows us something else really important. The quality of the data is as crucial as the quantity.
So it's not just about having lots of data, but the right data.
Exactly. And that's what makes OS Genesis so exciting. It's not just generating tons of data, but good quality, diverse, and useful data that can really teach those AI agents how to interact with the digital world.
Okay, we've covered a lot here. Data diversity, the limitations of current AI models, comparing to human data, the amount of data needed. I think we're ready to move on and talk about the broader implications of this research.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we've really dug into the details of how OS Genesis works and how it's changing the game for training AI agents. Now, I want to zoom out a bit.
Okay.
Look at the big picture. What does this mean for the future? Where could this lead?
The possibilities are kind of mind-blowing, honestly.
Yeah?
OS Genesis basically shows us how to create AI that learns complex stuff just by watching and doing.
Right.
And that has implications way beyond digital assistants.
Really? So we're talking AI that could learn to do like anything a human can,
Yeah.
just by watching and trying things out.
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible.
Oh.
Think about robotics, where teaching a robot to do intricate stuff requires tons of programming.
Right.
Now imagine showing a robot how to do something and it figures out the rest.
Oh, wow.
Using a system like OS Genesis to basically create its own training data.
That's incredible. Think about manufacturing, healthcare, even space exploration.
Yeah.
Robots could adapt to all sorts of new environments and challenges without us needing to reprogram them constantly.
Exactly. And it's not just physical stuff.
Okay.
This learn by watching could revolutionize things like scientific research.
Right.
Imagine AI analyzing huge data sets, identifying patterns, even designing experiments all on its own.
Wow, like giving scientists a team of super smart research assistants that could speed up scientific discoveries like crazy.
Yeah. And don't forget about education.
Oh, right.
What if we had personalized learning where an AI tutor adapts to each student?
Like knows exactly how to help you learn best.
Yeah, that could totally change education.
Yeah.
And this could even apply to creative fields like art, music, writing.
So AI could learn to paint, compose, or write novels.
By studying what human artists have done, yeah.
It makes you wonder if there's anything this AI won't be able to do someday.
It's a fascinating question. While I don't think AI will ever fully replace human creativity, it could become an amazing tool, one that enhances our own abilities.
Okay, so we've got all these amazing possibilities,
Yeah.
but we also need to be realistic. What about the downsides? Are there ethical things we should be thinking about as this tech develops?
Of course, there are risks, like with any powerful technology.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember AI is a tool.
Uh-huh.
It can be used for good or bad. It depends on how we develop and use it.
That's a good point. We have to think about the consequences and make sure we're guiding this in a direction that helps everyone.
For sure. For example, one thing we have to address is making sure AI is developed without bias.
Because if these systems learn by watching us, they could pick up on our biases too, right?
Exactly. We have to be careful about the data used to train them, make sure it represents lots of different perspectives.
Yeah, we don't want AI that just makes things worse.
Yeah.
What about jobs? If AI can do so many tasks that humans do, what happens to the people who rely on those jobs?
That's a tough one that we need to start figuring out now.
Yeah.
I don't think AI will totally replace human workers, but it'll definitely change what work looks like.
So it's about adapting.
Yeah.
We need to prepare for these changes, invest in education and retraining, and create new opportunities for people whose jobs might be affected.
Exactly. It's not just about the tech, it's about making sure everyone benefits from AI and that we deal with any negative stuff that might happen.
Sounds like we need to be having some serious talks about responsible AI.
Definitely.
Make sure it's used for good and creates a better future for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. This is a huge moment for AI, and it's up to all of us to make sure we use it wisely.
Really well said. So I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into OS Genesis. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is that we're at a turning point in AI. OS Genesis shows us a whole new way of thinking about how we train these systems. We're moving away from rigid instructions to a more flexible, exploratory approach.
Yeah,
This opens up amazing possibilities, but it comes with big responsibilities too.
couldn't agree more. Exciting times, but we have to be careful and make sure we use this to make things better for everyone.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of AI and OS Genesis. We hope you learned something new, and we encourage you to keep exploring this awesome field. Until next time, keep diving.